And thanks to all of you for hanging around for the last talk of the last session about Southern Ocean carbon. So taking, I guess, a pretty big step back, life on Earth is based on carbon, right? So we have the concentration of carbon-containing greenhouse gases in our atmosphere controlling variability in the climate on our planet. But the vast majority of carbon in the Earth system is not in the atmosphere, and it's also not in the terrestrial biosphere. It's in the ocean. So the carbon cycle is a way of describing and quantifying the continuous movement or exchange of carbon between the major reservoirs. And over long time scales, the exchange of carbon between the atmosphere and the ocean is actually what determines the transition between a glacial period or an ice age and an interglacial period, like the warm period that we live in now. So probably not a surprise to anybody in this room, but maybe worth repeating that the atmospheric concentration of CO2 is now 50% higher than it was in the pre-industrial era. And it's predicted to increase at similar or potentially accelerating rates over the next century. So the panel at the top here is two important observational records. In black, we have the concentration of atmospheric CO2 made from measurements collected at the Kennewick Cape Grim Observatory, and that's over about the last 20 years. That's the black line. And underneath that, in blue, we have observations of CO2 concentration in the surface ocean made from moorings that are deployed at the Southern Ocean Time Series, which is about 500 kilometers southwest of Tasmania. So you see, hopefully, quite clearly that the blue line, which is the ocean there, has a much larger seasonal variability than the atmosphere, but also that it tracks the atmospheric increase over these last 20 years. So you see that they're both having the same trend in time. This is an illustration of the tremendous service that the ocean is providing for all of us by absorbing about 25% of our anthropogenic emissions. So if you look now at the figure on the bottom, this is a longer time series back to the 1960s. And this is the best estimate from the Global Carbon Project of how much CO2 enters the ocean. And that's in gigatons of carbon per year, with a reminder or a little extra that 1 gigaton is something like 6 million blue whales. So the black line, the heavy black line in the middle of all the other ones like spaghetti, is our best estimate of how much CO2 goes into the ocean every year over this long time period. And it lies somewhere between the green or turquoise lines, which are based on observations, and the dark blue lines, which are based on model simulations. And this gets updated every year. The bar plot that's inset at the bottom there shows the number of observations that go into making these estimates. And so you can see that those ramped up steadily from the 1980s, peaked sometime around the early 2000s, and now have begun to drop off, which is something that I'll come back to if I have time. If we take now a closer look at our own backyard, right? We're all here to talk about the Southern Ocean today, and you've already heard from a couple of different speakers that it has an outsized role in the global carbon cycle. And that's because it takes up 40% of the global ocean contribution to taking up CO2. That happens in the Southern Ocean. So this figure is about the change in anthropogenic CO2 in the ocean between 1994 and 2007, because this is a static map, okay? And this is shown as an inventory. So it's the sum of all the anthropogenic CO2 from the surface of the ocean all the way down to the seafloor as a global map. And the blue areas show very little or perhaps no accumulation up until 2007. And the green and yellow areas show relatively higher accumulations. So hopefully there are two dominant regions that stand out to you. One is in the North Atlantic, and the other one is this broad circumpolar band in the Southern Hemisphere and in the Southern Ocean. Now, we know that the Southern Ocean is not a static map. We know that it's variable, and we know that the CO2 sink is variable. And in fact, there was a period in the 1990s when it weakened or stagnated quite significantly. And this was followed by a reinvigoration or a strengthening about a decade later. And I want to emphasize that this variability is quite important. So here are the current fossil fuel emissions in terms of the sources on the left-hand side, so fossil fuels and land use change, and the sinks on the right-hand side, where it ends up. It ends up either in the ocean, the terrestrial biosphere, or the ocean. If you were to imagine a weakening of the Southern Ocean CO2 sink over the coming decades that did not correspond to a proportional decrease in fossil fuel emissions, that means more CO2 stays in the atmosphere. That would intensify warming and the climate risks that come along with that warming, many of which we've heard about today. So what would make the Southern Ocean and the global ocean, I guess, by analogy, sink more strong or more weak, weaker or stronger? Well, that comes down to a combination of physics and biology. We've heard a little bit about both of those things today. So starting with the biology and looking at the schematic on the top. In the upper sunlit layers of the ocean, phytoplankton grow and do photosynthesis just like plants on land, right? They use energy from the sun, nutrients, and CO2, and they convert that into biomass. That biomass, as Daniel just told us, forms the base of quite an elaborate food web in the Southern Ocean and supports marine life. Now, some of that biomass is going to escape being eaten, and it's going to sink. Some of it will then be respired back to CO2, and a smaller fraction of it might sink all the way down to the seafloor. Over long time scales, this process leads to a gradient in CO2 in the ocean, such that there's more at depth than there is at the surface. And that allows CO2 from the atmosphere to keep on coming in. That's referred to as the biological carbon pump. If we move now to the physics and the schematic on the bottom, we know that gases are more soluble in cold water. So what do I mean? I mean that cold water is able to hold more dissolved gas. So CO2 is a dissolved gas, so is oxygen in seawater, and cold water is able to hold more of them. So think about that like you have a carbonated drink, and if you let it sit on the counter and it warms up, it tends to go flat quicker than if you would put it in the fridge. So as we heard from Paul earlier, in polar regions and in Antarctica and quite specific regions, we have the formation of dense water that travels from the surface where it has recently interacted with the atmosphere into the interior of the ocean. When it is then transported towards the equator, it's carrying a big load of dissolved CO2 with it. Now, some of that water is going to soon be upwelled back to the surface where it can release some of that CO2 back to the atmosphere. But other fractions of that water are going to stay in the ocean interior where the CO2 is sequestered or prevented from re-exchanging with the atmosphere over centuries or longer. And this one is referred to as a physical or maybe just solubility pump. So as we've heard from a number of other speakers today, we expect changes to these things to impact the way that the ocean carbon sink works. We expect warming and changes in ocean circulation to impact how much CO2 the Southern Ocean is able to take up. We're also expecting changes in biological productivity and primary production because of climate change. But what is less certain is how these things are going to interact. It's how these things are going to interact to change the overall functioning of the Southern Ocean CO2 sink, and ultimately how much anthropogenic CO2 we can continue to rely on it taking up. Okay, so you've also heard a lot about uncertainty today, the things that we're able to tell you with confidence and the things that we have less certainty about. And so while Australia has undoubtedly provided global leadership in acquiring observations of Southern Ocean CO2 flux or exchange that are used to build these regional and global assessments, we still are limited in what we know. So the map on the top shows the Australian contribution. So these are ship tracks that show the positions of the ships making measurements of CO2 in the Southern Ocean. And the lines that are colored red are the lines that are maintained or contributed by Australia. The lines that are colored gray are those that are contributed by other nations, so notably the US, New Zealand, Germany, and Japan, and the size of the flag is scaled by the size of that contribution. However, and we've heard about this already today, right? We have a bias in our observations that is mostly, they are collected during the summer and ice-free period. So not only do we lack observations in broad areas, but the observations that we do have systematically are collected in the summer season. This matters because it leaves us with an observational bias. So this is a map of the whole globe again, and this is the observational bias in all ocean CO2 uptake estimates, where the green colors get darker as the bias gets larger, and hopefully you can see clearly that most of those green areas are in the Southern Hemisphere and in the Southern Ocean. At the moment, so that's as of 2025, our best estimate of how much CO2 is going into the Southern Ocean is about 3 gigatons per year. But the uncertainty on that is large, right? 0.4 gigatons, which is about equivalent to all of Australia's national net emissions. So annual emissions of Australia are the uncertainty on that number. And I want to make a point, probably won't do it as eloquently as Steve, but that is important because that number and those uncertainties make their way into our projections of decadal and centennial climate change. But they also make their way into the models that are used to make decisions about what kind of adaptation and mitigation strategies the nation is going to need. So having an improved understanding of how much CO2 goes into the Southern Ocean is really critical for making decisions about what kind of future we're going to have and whether we can rely on it to continue to provide us this service by taking up such a big fraction of our anthropogenic emissions.